Before the gun, before the bomb, there is a piece of shaped metal with an edge. It starts as a longer knife. It ends up shaping every civilization that ever reaches for power. Before the sword, there is only stone. The earliest weapons are axes, spears, and knives, tools borrowed from hunting, turned toward war. Nobody has yet imagined what longer and sharper could become. Around 3300 BCE, metalworkers in the ancient Near East discover they can smelt copper ore and pour it into shapes. Blades get longer, then longer still. The real leap comes when someone mixes copper with tin and creates bronze, harder, more elastic, and far less likely to shatter. You can now cast a blade nearly a meter long that holds its shape under impact. The oldest swords we can confidently identify come from the Aegean world. Minoan and Mycenaean blades, dated by some archaeologists to around 1700 BCE, found in tombs in Crete and mainland Greece. These are not crude hacks. They are leaf-shaped, with a central ridge down the blade for rigidity and fitted with handles of bone or ivory riveted to a metal tang. Someone thought hard about these. Owning a bronze sword in 1700 BCE signals wealth, trade access, and power. Across Egypt, the Hittite Empire, and Mycenaean Greece, pharaohs and warlords are depicted clutching them in stone carvings. A smith carves a mold from stone or clay, pours in molten bronze, and waits. Once cooled, he hammers the edges thin and sharp. The whole process demands skill that takes years to acquire. Around 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age world falls apart. The great palace cultures of the Aegean vanish. Trade routes that carried tin, the ingredient that makes bronze possible, collapse almost overnight. What replaces bronze is iron. Iron ore exists almost everywhere, but it behaves differently. You cannot cast it. You heat it and hammer it, beating out impurities. Early iron is actually softer than bronze. Over centuries, smiths across Eurasia learn that adding carbon to iron during forging creates something harder: steel. By around 900 BCE, iron and steel swords are spreading from the Middle East into Europe and Asia. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome equips its legions with a short iron sword called the gladius, roughly 50 centimeters long, double-edged, designed for stabbing rather than slashing, and lethal in tight formation. Roman infantry doctrine demands staying in line. A short thrusting sword works perfectly inside a shield wall, where a long slashing blade would have no room to swing. The gladius helps Rome hold an empire for centuries. When Rome collapses in the 5th century CE, Germanic tribes enter carrying longer swords, the spatha, built for cavalry. The sword changes shape again to match the new reality, mounted warriors striking from above. By the 9th century, Viking smiths in Scandinavia are producing blades of remarkable quality. Some swords stamped with the name Ulfbert contain crucible steel, a refined alloy researchers once believed Europe could not yet produce. Other Norse smiths twist iron rods of different carbon content together, hammer them into blades, then grind and etch the surface to reveal a rippled pattern in the steel. The twist is not decoration. It strengthens the blade. In medieval Europe, the sword becomes the defining symbol of knighthood. A knight's sword is blessed by a priest, given a name, and sometimes buried with him. It is identity made of steel. As plate armor improves through the 13th and 14th centuries, swords grow longer and more pointed. The longsword, gripped with 2 hands, delivers thrusts aimed precisely at gaps between armored joints. The craft is codified in manuscripts called Fechtbücher, fighting books. German masters like Johannes Liechtenauer in the 14th century describe complete systems of footwork, grip changes, and half-swording, where you grab your own blade to thrust at close range. On the other side of the world, Japanese smiths are developing their own path to steel. They smelt iron sand in a clay furnace called a tatara, burning for 3 days and nights to produce Tamahagane jewel steel. The smith then folds and hammers the steel repeatedly. The precise number of folds varies by school, but the resulting blade contains thousands of individual layers, distributing carbon evenly and eliminating impurities that would cause the blade to crack. The finished Japanese blade has a hard, brittle edge for sharpness and a softer, flexible spine to absorb shock. Achieving both in a single piece of steel is one of the great technical feats of pre-industrial metallurgy. By the Muromachi period, roughly the 14th and 15th centuries, the curved, single-edged sword called the katana is the definitive weapon of the samurai. Carrying one is not a choice. It is an identity. A single katana takes months to complete. The swordsmith, the polisher, and the handle maker are separate specialists. The finished sword is signed by its maker, and individual blades carry documented histories spanning centuries. In 15th and 16th century Europe, firearms begin spreading and plate armor fades. Without armor to defeat, the sword can grow thin and fast. The rapier emerges, slender, needle-pointed, designed for dueling rather than battle. Fencing masters open academies across Europe's cities. Camillo Agrippa publishes an illustrated guide to rapier technique in 1553, teaching nobles that combat is a matter of geometry and timing, not brute strength. Dueling with rapiers becomes epidemic in 17th century France. By some estimates, thousands of French nobles die in private duels during the reign of Henry IV alone. The king bans them, repeatedly. Nobody listens. By the mid-17th century, the musket reshapes the battlefield. A line of musketeers has no answer for a swordsman, only the reverse is true. The sword's 5,000-year reign as the primary weapon of war is quietly ending. The sword doesn't vanish, it adapts. Cavalry troopers carry curved, single-edged sabers well into the 19th century. The British Light Brigade charges with sabers at Balaclava in 1854 in a famous and catastrophic assault. The Industrial Revolution moves sword production into factories. Sheffield in England and Solingen in Germany become centers of industrial blade manufacturing, supplying armies across Europe and beyond with standardized military sabers by the thousands. By World War I, charging with a saber against barbed wire and machine guns is suicidal. Officers still carry swords on parade, but the last significant battlefield use of the sword in Western warfare ends around 1918. Japan is the exception. Military officers carry swords through World War II, partly tradition, partly a symbol of command authority. The sword remains live equipment in an age of aircraft and artillery. After 1945, General MacArthur orders Japanese swords surrendered. Thousands are confiscated or destroyed. An art that took millennia to refine nearly disappears within a decade of peace. Today, Japan licenses only a small number of new swordsmiths each year. Each is permitted to make no more than 2 swords per month. A traditionally made katana can sell for the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars. 5,000 years of swordsmiths feed directly into modern metallurgy. The understanding of carbon steel, heat treatment, and differential hardening developed at the forge is the same science we now use in engines, bridges, and surgical tools. The sword never left culture even when it left the battlefield. It appears on the coats of arms of nations, cities, and families across the world, symbol of justice, authority, and the willingness to defend both. In Britain, the sword of state is carried before the monarch at the state opening of Parliament, a ceremony whose essentials have remained unchanged for centuries. The sword literally represents royal authority in the chamber of law. When a British monarch taps a sword on a shoulder to confer a knighthood, the gesture traces its form to medieval dubbing ceremonies. One motion connects a 21st century recipient to the 12th century. Fencing has been part of every modern Olympic Games since Athens in 1896. The épée, the foil, and the saber are direct descendants of the dueling traditions of Renaissance Europe, reborn as competitive sport. The sword is embedded in language so deeply we no longer notice. To be sharp, to cut to the chase, to be two-edged, the sword left its shape in English long after it left the hand. In fiction, the sword never dies. From Tolkien's Anduril to the lightsaber, which is, explicitly, a laser sword, the object carries emotional weight no firearm can replicate. It has always meant something. A gun kills at a distance. The sword demands proximity, training, and commitment. That is why every culture that builds one eventually uses it to symbolize authority, not because it is efficient, but because it shows will. The design of a civilization's sword reveals everything about it. The Roman gladius says discipline beats heroism. The katana says perfection is worth any cost. The rapier says elegance and lethality are the same thing. There is an unbroken human line from the Mannone smith pouring bronze into a stone mold around 1700 BCE to a licensed Japanese swordsmith folding Tamahagen today. The metal changes. The obsession does not. It started as a longer knife. It became the symbol of everything civilization cares most deeply about: justice, honor, power, beauty, death. No object in history has carried so many meanings for so long. The sword is still here, on flags and altars, in courts of law, in stadiums, in stories. It is the shape the human imagination reaches for when it needs to say, "This is serious. This matters." This is Origins. Subscribe and come back tomorrow. There's a new origin every single morning.